Hello, and welcome to the Oxford and Microsoft webinar series. Today's webinar is on Windows Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. And with me here today is Mike Levin and Mark Riley, architect actually now. And today they're going to be presenting on both the features and benefits associated with the product and a product demo that will be preceded with a Q&A period. Please proceed to the next slide. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Oxford Computer Group. We're a identity access and data protection company, and we really focus in three areas with clients. One is whatever the project you're going to embark upon, we help you with an education process so that you can have successful projects and leave, when we leave after the implementation, that you have the ability to manage the implementation yourselves. So that's the education portion, the preparation, and all good journeys start with a good planning session. Those are 1 to 6 week envisioning sessions that give you multi-year roadmaps with phases that allow you to make sure that you are planning for the future and implementing for today. And lastly, implementation and support. We have an experienced group of architects and senior consultants and project and engagement managers to make sure that you have a successful implementation and have support and maintenance agreements to take care of after. And the major areas of our consultancy are in directory, federation, identity management, directory consolidation with virtualization, strong authentication. As you see today, we'll be talking about MFA, and also into information protection with data classification and encryption of data. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael Levin. Thank you, sir, and have a good demo, a good webinar.
Thanks, Marvin, and just want to give you guys a quick heads up about what we'll be covering in the next few minutes. I'm going to give you, I will spend a few minutes giving you an overview of Azure Multi-Factor Authentication and some of the features and benefits. And in the middle of that, we'll show you a demo of the end user experience. I will then hand it off to Mark Riley, who will talk a little bit about the architecture and the way Azure MFA can be configured. He will follow that up with a demonstration of the back office, which will hopefully prove to you all some of the assertions that I make in the PowerPoint slides. And if there is any time left, we will take questions and answers as submitted by the audience. So with that being said, let me discuss a little bit. I think most of you know what multi-factor authentication is, or you wouldn't be here, but just for a little background, multi-factor authentication is two factors. One factor which has been around most of the time there's been remote access. This is, of course, something you know, which is typically your username and password. The second factor is usually something you have, which has traditionally been a hardware token or a smart card, but more and more is becoming a phone or a tablet, or that other factor could be something you are, which could be voice biometrics, retina scan, fingerprint, something that really is unique to you. So something you have, something you know or are the components of multi-factor authentications. We'll talk a little bit about doing this out of band, which makes multi-factor authentication even more secure, but that will be for a later slide. Azure Multi-Factor Authentication is not a new product. It is a service that is based on an acquisition that Microsoft did about 1.5 years ago of a company called PhoneFactor, which has been providing multi-factor authentication for at least 6 years. It has had thousands of customers at the time of the acquisition, doing millions of monthly authentications for all kinds of use cases, including VPNs, HR portals, banking, bank applications, online banking, healthcare, remote patient access, and all sorts of configurations, including identities being in the cloud on premise. So the point is simply this is an established product that has been proven over as many configurations and as many authentications as you can imagine. On the next slide, I want to hand it off now to Mark. This may take a second to shift the slide, but I'd like Mark to demonstrate the end user experience. Many of you are going to be familiar with tokens. If you're not, the token experience is typically you log into a user to some portal, you put in your username and password, and then it asks you at the same time for a 6-digit one-time password along with a fixed PIN. You put that all in at the same time, and then it authenticates you. But with Azure Multi-Factor Authentication, as you can see, this is Mark's login to the Azure Multi-Factor Authentication portal. He's put in his username and password, and when I say go, he's going to click, and you will see what happens. So Mark, go ahead and hit enter. It's looking up his username password. If that was incorrect, you'd get the denial screen immediately, but if it's correct, it sends the phone on your behalf, and the phone rings, pops up, he acknowledges the call, and I guess it did not happen this time. So in this case, if it is allowed by the, well, we'll come back. Mark, why don't you do that again? And can you talk so they can hear what's going on?
I see Mark's phone's on mute, so sometimes that...
Yes. Okay, so we didn't have his sound on, so you couldn't hear the phone ringing. But what happened there is he put in his username and password. The multi-factor authentication service rang his phone, and we'll show you the architecture behind that a little bit later. His phone rang. He answered the call. He hit the pound sign to acknowledge the call. And as soon as he hit the pound sign, he was allowed in. So, as is often happens, the demo is not nearly as good as the actual experience. So let's go back to the slide deck. And what you just saw, we have some options available for your end users. What you just saw there is the phone method. Again, putting your username and password, phone rings, you acknowledge the call, and you're let in. There are two other options. One is the SMS method. So with SMS, again, you log in with your username and password, and it sends you a one-time PIN to your text-enabled phone, and you respond back into the phone with that one-time PIN along with the pound, and if you did that correctly, you will be allowed in. The third and fastest growing method is the mobile app, and that works for any tablet, whether it's an iOS, an Android, or a Windows device. Same thing, you log in with your username and password, and then the push network sends a message, and that's virtually instantly. It's amazing how fast the push notification gets there. Pops up the app on your device, which basically says, I see you're trying to log in, hit yes to authenticate, no to deny, or no, or a third button which says no to report fraud. So again, then you click, you press the button, and you're allowed in. So those are the three choices. The one thing those three choices all have in common, back to that out-of-band comment, is that they are 100% out of band. So what that means is you're putting your username and password into one channel, typically the browser, and then the second factor is completed through a completely separate channel, in this case the phone network or the push network. Again, with tokens as a typical alternative, you're putting your username, your password, and the one-time PIN all in the same channel, so that if that channel, the browser, has been compromised, then the bad guy has all the credentials he needs to compromise your system. And that has been documented as happening on multiple occasions. So all three of those methods Azure MFA offers is 100% out of band. We also have a soft token version based off of the application, which for certain cases, such as being in an airplane, you can use a soft token approach to authenticate. And that's an option that's available if the IT security team chooses to make that available. So on this slide, those were the three methods. This next slide really is the elevator pitch, kind of the big picture recognition of Azure MFA, and we'll dive into these in a moment. But because of these three factors, the convenience of Azure MFA, its scale and scalability, and the security, and also the fact it can be used, well, because of convenience, scale, and security, you can use it for any user, be it an employee, partner, vendor, customer, any device, from any location, any phone, any device, anywhere in the world. So this is a complete enterprise solution. You can use it to replace tokens. You can use it to augment them. You can use it in a narrow use case, but it will work in any configuration, any use case, any population. Diving into that into a little more detail, the convenience. Convenience is both to the end user, as demonstrated by that experience, and for your IT team, the ease to support and implement and maintain. You don't have to deal with devices to purchase or distribute or to replace when they lose them. The users will replace their own phones or their own tablets if they lose or break them. There is virtually no training. That actually takes place in less than 5 minutes in the user self-registration process. And as Mark will demonstrate in a few minutes, there is a user portal for them to manage their own methods, their own self-management, and self-registration. And again, from the IT department, Azure MFA integrates with AD and LDAP and proprietary directories, so it is easy for you to manage your users, set it up, and automate enrollment. When we talk about scale, which is the next slide, again, we work with Azure MFA works with virtually all on-premises applications. The legal department makes me say virtually, but really anything that speaks radius, all of the leading VPNs, things like that. Supports ADFS and SAML, and we also have an SDK, so that if you're building your own application and you want to add MFA to your application, that's easy to do. Add a couple lines of code, and you can do that. And you can architect Azure MFA for both redundancy within your organization, so that you can use it for mission critical scenarios. And Microsoft has multiple data centers, fully redundant, live backup, excess capacity, so that you can be confident, and we have demonstrated over the years a 5.9 level of reliability. So again, this service can be used for mission critical applications. And again, with regard to the security, I've already spoken at length about 100% out of band. We have a feature I alluded to earlier called Fraud Alert, so that if, for example, you're out on the golf course or you're home cooking dinner, and your phone goes off and you hear the recording saying, "This is your company's security calling to complete authentication. Click the pound, press the pound sign to finish authentication." You know you didn't log in your home cooking dinner. You know your username and password has been compromised. So you can certainly just hang up, or you can report fraud. And typically, our customers, that's configurable, but it's either typically £0 or 911 pound. And if you do that, that will lock the account immediately until your security department manually unlocks it, or and simultaneously will send a fraud alert to your designated recipient so that real-time forensics can begin. We also talked about the PIN option. Typically, or as we demonstrated, the phone rings, you answer, and you hit pound to complete the authentication. Sometimes our customers like to add a little more security, and you can add a fixed PIN like an ATM code. So instead of hitting pound, you hit your 4-digit fixed PIN and then the pound sign, and then that lets you in. It's actually configurable to, I think, more digits than anybody can remember, but typically our users configure it to 4 or 6-digit pins, and all of the processes for managing pins are automated and configurable, so you can require, changing the pin every 6 months. You can check for not consecutive numbers or not the same numbers, and make sure the PIN meets certain strength requirements. We also have extensive real-time and ad hoc reporting and logging so that you can audit and manage your network for security threats. And we have been certified and audited for compliance with all the major regulatory agencies. So that pretty much completes the, I did also want to mention there is a free version of Azure MFA that is available. It is available with purchases of Office 365, and it's good for use with Office 365 only. So some of you may have heard about this, but again, it is available only with use for Office 365, and is really a basic multi-factor authentication experience added on to the login process. But all of the other features that we've talked about and the capability for any other application, any use case, any device, any configuration, that remains with the full-featured Windows Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. So in case anybody had heard there was a free version, we wanted to make sure the differences were clear there. So that completes my discussion, at least my assertions. Mark Riley will now jump in, talk about the configuration, and demonstrate the configuring and user portals, so that you'll see that I'm not just making this up. Mark, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Michael. So I want to start off here by just taking a look at the architecture and how the flow operates when the multi-factor authentication piece is added onto our authentication. So you see that users logging on from any device, it's not specific, whatever device you're using, be that tablet, phone, your desk PC, kiosk, whatever it might happen to be, to an on-premise app, which can be all sorts of types of apps. One of the, as Michael mentioned, one of the more frequent use cases we see at this point is connecting through VPN servers or Citrix VDI implementations or IIS applications. We're also finding a lot of use cases for ADFS to leverage MFA on top of ADFS functionality. But that call is made, and whatever authentication mechanism is being used, be that Radius, LDAP, IIS, or remote desktop VDI, we pass on the authentication to the multi-factor authentication server, which I'll show you here shortly, which is local for these on-premises apps. The multi-factor authentication server then contacts our back-end directory, whether that's AD or another LDAP instance, or it could even be another Radius server in the case of Radius authentication, performs that authentication first, and if that authentication succeeds, then a call is made to the multi-factor authentication service in the cloud, and that is the service that actually looks up your phone number, dials your phone number, doesn't look it up, it's passed by the local server. We don't store anything up in the cloud. So the local service requests that the cloud service make the call or the SMS or the notification to a authenticator application on a phone or tablet, and will take that response from the user, whether the user authenticates the application, if the user authenticates the application, and send that back completing the auth process for those on-premises applications. We can also use, cloud applications can also use SAML against the multi-factor authentication service using ADFS. So from an application on my device, I can call a cloud app, which will use SAML against ADFS. MFA then calls out to the cloud, performs the same function, and returns the result, and returning the token to the cloud app to authenticate the user. We also have a case where we can work with Windows Azure Active Directory, where there is no component on premises, where a cloud application does the authentication against Windows Azure Active Directory, which directly calls the multi-factor authentication service in the cloud and performs the second factor auth on the user's device. And these the SDKs that speak directly to the MFA service, available in .NET, Java, PHP, a couple other platforms, I believe. We can check with Michael on those when we finish up here. And those calls can be managed directly within your application for very fine-grained access of the communication that you have with the user, including processing such requests as, you're attempting to move money from this account to that account, do you want to proceed? Those involve a bit more coding and kind of beyond our scope today, but those capabilities are in the product, and we can help you work through those should those be required. So we do want to step out of the presentation here and go back to my multi-factor authentication server. And as I mentioned, there's a local server on my machine. You see I'm running against a 2012 R2 server here, and I have my multi-factor authentication server. The status shows me that this server is up, and it also is running as a master. One of the features of multi-factor authentication allows me to have multiple local servers to support those on-premises applications. If I had multiple servers, they would be listed here. The first thing everybody wants to understand is, how do we get users into the system? And depending what back end I'm connected to, you can see I'm connected to an Active Directory. This could be LDAP. I select to import those users from my directory. In this case, I'm reaching out to my test LDAP, or excuse me, AD server, and I'm going to go ahead and grab users based on security groups. In this case, I have created a group in my AD called MFA users. You can see I have a number of test users here. I'm going to just select a single user and import that user. That user gets brought into the system, and the note here shows users with no phone numbers were imported as disabled. We'll see this user actually is disabled when we come in. The rest of this import page here, you see that we have various settings for the default settings as we bring users in. So I've set mine up that if the user has phone numbers configured in AD, if I have a mobile number configured, that will be my primary phone number for multi-factor authentication. If I have a business number configured, that will be my backup phone number for phone authentication. I also specify the default languages, which we may enable the user to change. There's complete language support in the product. We also determine what the default method of authentication will be for each user. I'm set to a standard phone call. I can change that to a phone call that requires a PIN that either I can set as an administrator or the user can set. I can choose a text message with a one-time password, or I can also force a one-time password and a PIN. So in the text message, we send a one-time password to the user. They reply to that text message with the one-time password, which is a short PIN, and that completes the process. Well, I can also use a mobile app, either standard or with a PIN. This allows, and we'll see this later, that the user, should you choose, can configure whatever option they would like to use. And as Michael stated, this is all out of band, right? So phone call out of band, SMS is out of band. There's nothing we're putting back in an application by default. So I brought that user in. As you see, the user in my multi-factor authentication server has a warning label here, and that is because the user is currently disabled because there's no phone number listed. This is exactly how you would bring new users into the system. And what happens, I've configured this to deliver mail when the user is added to the system. This mail is completely configurable as well. We'll see this, but you see that I have a URL included, which takes me right back to that multi-factor authentication server portal. So as that user, test user 05, I'm going to log in with my password, see if I have more success this time. And now, instead of that portal asking me to complete the multi-factor authentication, I'm taken into the multi-factor authentication user setup because this user is currently disabled, doesn't have a phone number configured. So I'm going to go ahead and drop my phone number in here. So if you want to get a hold of me, this would be the number to call. And you see that I only have two choices as a user. I can call to authenticate, or I can cancel, and the next time I log in here, it'll take me right back to this page. Instead, what I'm going to do is complete the process by calling me for authentication. Somehow I clicked off that. Mistake. Probably just timed out. I have a rather short timeout on this process. Let me just go back in here. This time it's going to go ahead and call me if it's saved it. Let's see what happens. Always fun to do a demo live. There we go. So it didn't save it. It timed out before I hit that. Let me try and get my number in and go ahead and call me now to authenticate. It's taking that number, passing it up to the service in the cloud. That service is now placing the call, and as you can hear, I'm getting a call again. You can even see my Bluetooth popping up on that. I'll answer the call,
Microsoft sign-in
put it on
verification
speaker.
system.
It's the same process we heard earlier.
You have been signed in.
I
Goodbye.
completed the process, and you see how quickly it took us to the resulting page. The next step in this process, because I've chosen to use security questions, is to prompt the user for security questions. But I want to stop right here for just a second and point out that as a user, now I'm completely trained on how to use this process. I log into a site. My phone rings, I answer the phone, press the proper button, and I move on. And if I had let that message continue, you would have heard the fraud prompt, which I believe you heard earlier. And so I'm totally trained at this point. These security questions are used to back up the process. And again, configurable. You can choose to offer these questions to the user. You can not enable security questions, and you can configure all of these questions on your own. So you can provide all of the questions for the user to use. The user provides the answers, and it provides a backup method to authenticate the user. This can be used to allow the user to bypass or to temporarily get in without multi-factor authentication. It can also be used by your help desk technicians to validate the user. So they can ask these questions, input the user's responses, and see whether those questions were correct or not before making some change for the user. It's just an additional security piece. We'll probably won't touch too much more on that. We'll take a look in the server, and I'll show you the configuration settings for the portal, but be aware that this portal has virtually all of the options turned on because I wanted them to be available to you. So from a user perspective, I have this ability for a one-time bypass. So I was able to authenticate, or perhaps I answered my questions. I can come in and configure a bypass, which will allow me to log on to sites that are protected by multi-factor authentication without performing the multi-factor authentication. Again, configurable if you don't want to allow this, if you don't want to allow the user to set the time, all configurable. As a user, I can also change my method. If I don't want to use the phone call, if I want to use text message or a mobile app, I can switch to those. I can update my phone number. I can also activate my mobile application. So I go to the store for my particular phone type, whether that's an iOS device, an Android device, or a Windows phone. There are authenticator apps for all three platforms. And you see I can either enter the activation code and the URL for my mobile application, or I can simply use the QR code and scan that in for the application. And if I want to update my security questions, I can update those security questions. As a user, I can even choose which of those questions you provide for me that I can use as my personal questions. So we'll come back and see a little more of the portal, but I wanted to take you through some of the options here and see. Let me bounce off this and come back into the users, and you'll see now I am configured with that phone number. You see my warning went away, and now that user is all set for multi-factor authentication. One of the most common use cases we see, as I said, is VPN access, providing multi-factor authentication against a VPN for internal access. And we can use VPN servers with either radius authentication or LDAP authentication. In both cases, we configure a client. For radius, of course, we configure an IP address. We give it an application name so that we can track those authentications in the log and understand which process, which client was connecting and authenticating to us. And then radius, of course, uses a shared secret to encrypt the data. And we can allow configure this shared secret here in our VPN server, and the two can communicate. Once I've set up the radius authentication, then I need to tell the multi-factor authentication server where it should find those users to authenticate them. As I said, the default is Windows domain, Active Directory domain. I can also send it to an LDAP server, so if I want to bind with LDAP instead of AD to a different server, or I can pass this up to another radius server, to chaining of radius. So if I have a radius server I want to add, then I add the same information, the IP address of that remote server, a shared secret, and what the authentication and accounting ports are for that. If I have additional attributes that I want to configure for profiles on that VPN, I can configure those and send those back to the VPN server from this, what is effectively a radius server running inside my MFA server. I also have this IP whitelist. I want to show it to you here, although VPN may not be the best use case for this. It's probably more commonly used in remote desktop scenarios for servers, where you might want the user to authenticate with multi-factor authentication if they're coming from the outside, but if they're coming from their desk, you're pretty confident they're the right person, they passed physical security in the building. We're just going to go ahead and let them in without making them do the multi-factor authentication. So I can add either a single IP address, an IP range, or an entire subnet that will be whitelisted and not be required to do the multi-factor authentication. And then for each service I have multi-factor auth servers that are running that service. If I had multiple servers, of course, they would be listed here. So we were talking about VPN, Radius. I'm going to jump to LDAP and show that at the same time. So you see I have an ASA configured here. I also then choose the target for this authentication. This is just going to go up to the normal AD authentication at this point, because I have not configured multiple LDAP servers to choose from, and also which servers I'm running on. So LDAP is pretty straightforward configuration. For IIS, I specify I can do both form-based. This requires a little bit of investigation because you have to potentially dig into the form and determine what fields hold the username, password, and if there's a domain variable in those fields. So this gives you a great deal of configuration ability underneath this to pick the information you want out of that form. You could even do a hidden field for the domain and save the user picking that up. A normal HTTP page using normal HTTP basic logon is configured with just the URL, an application name, timeout, and maximum session time as well. The event confirmation SDK, we mentioned that briefly. Again, it's a bit out of scope for today, but this allows me to do those kinds of operations that say, oh, it appears that you want to do this. Are you sure? And the user can respond yay or nay to that in the middle of a process. These are more often used in the middle of processes. I can track my sessions. I can also specify which proxy hosts I'm working through. Again, IP whitelist, so if I'm hitting that site internally, you can just let me through. And for what are now considered down-level clients, IS6 and IS7, we can use ISAPI filters, but as this is running on a 2012 R2 server, we just use a native mode instead, and the server recognizes that. The native module tells me what sites I'm going to connect and process the multi-factor authentication on. So with IIS-8, it's just dead simple to set this stuff up. We talked about LDAP. Windows authentication also allows me to cover terminal service for both RDP services, log me in services, and I can also set this up for, well, Citrix we tend to do more with LDAP or Radius. And as we said, there was an ADFS adapter that I can connect to ADFS, select the methods for the user's enrollment, and this allows me to do multi-factor authentication on any federated service that I choose to. So quite broad support. So stepping a little bit away from the actual services that we integrate with multi-factor authentication, I want to take a look at the broad company settings. So we saw most of these settings when we looked at the configuration in the portal, that you saw what the default settings are for which type of authentication we're going to do. What do we do when the internet is not accessible? Our default is to fail closed, so we fail authentication if the internet is not accessible to this application. I can also choose what to do when a user is disabled. And usually when you start off with multi-factor authentication, you will start with succeed authentication when a user is disabled. This allows users to still access their services until they get fully configured in the MFA server so as not to interrupt them. Once you get further down the road and you're ready to fully protect that resource, then you normally would flip this to say anyone who's not fully configured and set up for MFA will just fail authentication. Okay, but by default, we start off with succeed. Default languages, default PIN settings. Other settings in here, how I do username resolution. Because I'm running against Windows Active Directory, I use the SID for matching purposes. So when I import that user, it brings in their SID. So I reach out and validate them each time. We don't bring the user's password. Of course, we really couldn't for most cases. Don't bring the password information into the local server. We simply authenticate every time. So we're always checking up-to-date passwords on the users. I also am able to configure all of the text messages. So you see all the different languages for all the different text messages that are used in my SMS one-time password and one-time password PIN. So you can configure these as well. The text that's sent out to the mobile applications is configurable in this site as well as text for oath tokens. We didn't talk much about oath tokens, but oath tokens, this is not OAuth. Notice this is oath tokens. These are fixed tokens that a user can use instead of one-time passwords. We have support for oath tokens throughout the product here. And then what information to provide for the reports. All of the reporting is managed up on the cloud where the actual interaction with the user's device takes place. We're able to track such things as authentications, failed authentications, blocked because of fraud. We can unblock users from that site as well when they've reset their local password and we're ready to allow them back into the system. And this is just the information that we'll pass up. If for some reason your organization does not want the email address stored in those logs, we can clear that and we won't pass up the user's email for reporting purposes. You saw earlier that I got a mail when I brought in the user. The test user 05 was delivered a mail describing MFA and taking them into the process to train them and get them set up and enabled in the server. This is where the mail occurs. I'm just sending to a local SMTP server that then drops it into my mailbox. And all of that mail, as I said, is completely configurable for all the messages that we're sending out. So you can customize this. Normally what you'll do is set the information to the help desk, the from to the help desk, and that will allow us, any user responds to that, it'll come back to the help desk. I did kind of pass by that. Let me back up right here. In the company settings, oh, I missed it. In the company settings, it does allow you to specify the phone number that we use to call the user. And again, that is usually set to your help desk. So if somebody gets a call, doesn't know why they're getting it, and responds to that phone call, they'll go back to your help desk. It allows you to just put a number that appears normal to users in the system instead of some random number calling them every time. My directory integration, as I said, we can authenticate users against different backends. So I can choose whether I'm going to use Active Directory, or I can specify an LDAP configuration, and I specified my username to bind to that. I can choose filters. By default, you see these filters, and in most cases they work 100% of the time. Attributes that we pull back when we connect, and we can also synchronize. So you saw earlier I was pulling users from a group. I can set this synchronization up so that we go out to a particular group every 5 minutes or whatever I specify, check for new users or users who have been removed, and we will update those users in MFA based on their membership in the group or in an OU or any number of configuration settings that you can provide. And then based on that synchronization, we have the same settings that you saw when I did the import. And again, just listing all our MFA servers that we have. I said that we would see the configuration for the user portal. You can see here that I have just about everything checked to allow the users great functionality in the portal, to allow them to do all their configuration. If I didn't want the user to be able to select their methods, I can pull that out. I can also select which methods are allowed. You see I have the URL for the portal here, so that gets picked up by the emails and sent out. One of the nice things about the portal here is the ability to have a lot of granular control over what access an administrator or perhaps your help desk has in this server and in the portal as well. So what I might create some other group of users that were help desk users, and I might give them the ability to perform a one-time bypass for a user who's lost their phone. I might allow them to change the phone number for a user if a user got a new phone and needs to update that. I might allow them to unblock a user and maybe give them nothing else. Well, let them test authentication. But I can be very discreet about what settings I give to the users and what they can perform. I'm just going to go ahead and cancel that. No, I'd like not to. So that's the user portal setups. You see, I told you about the security questions. You can add and edit the security questions here. I also have the ability to set up past sessions. What this allows us to do is if a user isn't configured for a particular site, we can redirect them from a website to the portal to configure them. And this is what that allows us to set up. Configuration settings for SAML, I can enable it, set timeouts, add a certificate, so this will just let me go out and browse my certificate, and where do I redirect to after a logout. And again, the IP whitelist. So again, I can skip multi-factor authentication when users are logging into the portal from inside my organization. So those are most of the configuration settings. You see that I have a mobile app, web service URL, give it account name, do some work around that. I have all my logging files. I can synchronize with syslog if I choose, which syslog also allows me if I'm running, say, Operations Manager, it supports incoming files as a syslog, so we can integrate with that. I can just go out and browse my log files on the local server and resolve issues. And the one thing we talked a little bit about was the web service. There is a web service which allows me to connect directly with this multi-factor authentication server and perform functions such as adding users or updating phone numbers or doing other things if I wanted to do them through a web service SDK. So that's a brief overview of the functionality in the server. I'm going to bring the slide deck back up here and turn it back over as soon as that happens. Okay. Michael, did you want to take it back, or Marvin?
Yes, thank you very much, and that was an excellent demonstration through the whole piece. The last sort of overview portion of this is really saying, you know, what is it about Azure MFA that the value proposition associated with it, and it's really the convenience factor of not having to carry any other tokens around with you, that you can use your authentication device as the device which you usually have, which is your mobile phone or mobile type device. The scalability aspect is that you're not having to scale up servers because of the cloud hosting and your on-premises server managing, you know, the outbound calling and all those sort of pieces associated with it. And lastly, security, as your websites don't have a third location to put a password in, there's man-in-the-middle attack is greatly reduced, and you just have out-of-band calling on your phone. So organizational risks, regulatory compliance, these are achieved through this risk reduction, and enterprise ready. And you know that this is really what you saw with all the what Mark walked through, with VPN connectivities, with connection to directories, configuration. You know, it does not require a high level of IT integration work. It can be done in a relatively short period of time. And lastly, the total cost of ownership with the licensing, the way Microsoft has it set up, it could be per usage, so you buy 10 authentications, or you could buy a monthly usage rate, and it's according to what you need and how often you're authenticating. So very, very flexible system from that. On to the next slide, please. So upcoming, before we get to the Q&A session, we have webinars, additional webinars, and the first of them is the AD assessment and cleanup. The March 20th webinar for the NERC, we've moved that into May. And then after that, we have the Energy Sec presentation around NERC critical infrastructure protection, and that's going to be a round table type forum. And for any of you out there that are involved in protecting infrastructure of your company, this is relevant. It's not just in the electrical industry piece around that, but it's also an infrastructure that's designed to prevent cyber attack. Next slide, please. So also, as I mentioned in the beginning, Oxford Computer Group does training for companies and allow you to get ready. And as you can see, there's various levels of training here. The first is a 521. That's because many people have gone through the introductory level 1 and are ready to take the advanced consultant course, and this allows you to sort of run and operate your own systems. Then we're running a foundation course. This is a beginning level to give you a broad level of experience with FIM, so that if you're getting ready for an implementation or you've implemented and you want to understand it a little better, it's that. And then lastly, the expert level, which allows you to have a very good idea how you can continue to grow your own system and be self-sufficient in connecting new systems. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody, and we're going to turn to the Q&A session now. And we had quite a few questions accumulated during the webinar. The first is from Phil, and the question that was put out there by Phil was, FIM has self-service password reset with OTP functionality. So does this solution, Azure MFA, can these tie together? So that's an interesting question. So Mark, do you want to try to tackle that? I think I have a good understanding of that as well, but I'll let you go from the technical perspective.
Yes, so what we're talking about here is FIM has the self-service password reset, which is very similar in functionality to the bypass here, which we didn't delve into, but the ability for a user to answer a series of questions and based on those questions allow them to reset their password. FIM, the self-service password reset is a web service, so if you wanted to put multi-factor authentication wrapped around that entire process, it should be relatively simple to do. It's an exercise I should go ahead and do, actually. Not at this point, but at some point.
Then the next question out there is from Philip, and he said, please explain what happens if the user uses the wrong password at the start of the process. Well, we actually got to see that in the live demo, I think, and then it is checked. So is it checked directly against Active Directory? If so, will the user account be locked out if the fat fingered their password enough times to exceed the account lockout threshold in Active Directory? So this sounds like it requires a little bit of architectural explanation, and maybe it's best to go back to that slide to sort of walk through that. So again, maybe Mark, as you're finding that slide, we can go to that. Which
the point is, it's really going to work much like the actual any authentication would fail. So if the multi-factor authentication server, as you can see here, does the authentication against Windows Server AD or other LDAP. If I connect to my website, enter a bad password, it attempts the bad password and fails, it'll never go out and do the MFA at that point. It'll just send back a failure. I enter in the bad password again 2 or 3 more times, whatever I'm configured for to block it, it would still perform the same blocking function, which is exactly what you want. anyway. We're trying to protect that account. If someone is hammering against the account, trying to do a brute force attack, we want to stop that by picking up the fact that there have been multiple failures in the authentication, and that process still functions as normal.
Right. So it's really up, I think what I heard you say is it's the design of your application is going to determine things like denial of service attacks. That's up to the front end of the application. The MFA portion is really once the service has made the initial authentication, it then will reach out and make the multi-factor authentication. Is that sort of correct, Mark?
That's correct.
Okay, good. A simple way for the user to register via FIM is the question. So how do you, I guess the question's around user registration and could you do that via FIM?
Using the web service SDK, you would be able to create the FIM management agent that talked to the server, and you could configure users that way. If you wanted to have FIM provision your users in multi-factor authentication as part of the process of provisioning and deprovisioning your users using that, it certainly could be done.
And then a follow-on question from that one was, maybe I missed it, but is there an automated SSO experience for end users that integrated maybe with FIM? SSO experience.
Well, so MFA doesn't really provide an SSO experience.
Yeah.
It is really just an adjunct to an existing sign-on. So if I was using ADFS for SSO and I put MFA in ADFS, then whenever I was required to authenticate, when those tokens expired on that federated access, I would be required to perform the multi-factor authentication. When those tokens were used during their normal life cycle, I would not be required to do multi-factor because I'm not coming back to this authentication piece back here.
And if I remember correctly, there is a feature within ADFS that you can require to have multi-factor authentication. So
correct.
Yeah, which doesn't have to do with single sign-on. It just means that you could have a more secure ADFS token being sent out that required single sign-on at the application level. Okay, could the user's phone be registered by administration with FIM, for example, as well as a challenge questions, right? So it sounds like, again, using the FIM interface to update so I think in my thoughts around that is when we've done FIM implementation, there's the concept of self-service user fields, and you certainly could make the mobile field a user field where they could put that in. Now, how you would then have the questions and that put into the MFA, I'm going to turn over to Mark and see.
Yeah, I haven't looked into the web SDK for that, but everything else that I've attempted to do in the system, I could configure those questions. I should be able to do it through the web SDK.
Right.
Right.
But the field for filling in the phone number could easily be populated via the FIM portal to AD, and AD would then, when Azure MFA picked it up, would see that there's a phone number there. Is that perhaps how that could flow?
Yeah, well, when I import a user, I'm able to tell it to bring in a phone number and a backup phone number from a field in Active Directory or an LDAP attribute. And so FIM could configure that in the directory, and then when the user's imported, that's just automatically brought in. And in fact, I can configure the server to keep users' phone numbers up to date. So we could have the user update their phone number through the FIM portal. That would update it in AD, and MFA would pick that up as a matter of course.
And then part two is a challenge question. So I think that's to be discovered and come back to on that one.
Right.
There's a question from Lynn, which was, thanks, I understand that an unexpected logon presenting a second factor challenge would allow a user to X lock the account, otherwise report the event. So yeah, so there, I think Lynn's speaking that if you suddenly receive the phone call, as Mike talked about over dinner, and you're not logging on, then you could lock your account. But then Lynn goes on to say, but let's say we have a simple VPN authentication. Can the bad guy know just the usernames and enter them along with a series of random passwords and lock accounts? I think that goes a little bit back to what we were talking about in Philip's question, which is how does the application sort of manage lockout versus how does Azure MFA, how do those two systems work separately? And Mark, if you want to elaborate on that at all, just going back to...
Yeah, I think the question is, if someone knows my username, can they perform this lockout function by simply typing my username and essentially brute forcing, as we were talking about, the password? And the fact is, until my authentication against that back end, in this diagram shown by Windows Server, AD, or other LDAP, or it could be Radius Server, when that multi-factor authentication server connects to that directory and attempts the authentication and it fails, there's no continuing in the process. It simply returns. So whatever would normally happen for a user typing in a username and a bad password, if after 5 attempts you lock them out, that would still occur. There's no change to that process.
Then Kelly asks, can you import your users from Azure AD?
Well,
so I guess that would be, I have Azure AD, and then if I was running my Azure MFA in the cloud, the answer is you would pick your source from Azure AD to populate the server, the MFA server. And if it was an on-premises server, could you take the users from Azure AD and download them to the on-premise server? And I'm not sure about that, so I'll ask you, Mark.
Well, I would believe that would be the case, that you would simply configure MFA in your Azure instance, because you're going up. If you're going to Azure to authenticate, then that's where you would do the multi-factor authentication. If you're authenticating against a local AD instance, then you use the local server. So if your users are totally up in Azure AD and not just dir synced and using ADFS on the local end, then you would use multi-factor authentication in Azure. So what we showed today was the local server piece of that. We didn't look at all of the Azure piece.
Okay, good. The next question is regarding VPN integration. Are you able to use the phone call, or is more the classic OTP generated by the app, which can be used in the case where Azure MFA actually is a classic Radius server? So let's break that question down. Regarding VPN integration, are you able to use the phone call? So I think the answer is yes, right?
Yes.
And then the next question on that, or elaboration of that, is it more of a classic OTP generated by the app, which is also yes, because if you chose to have the OTP out of the app where you don't have your phone working because there's no signal, then it could generate an OTP as well, correct?
Yeah, I think Michael might actually be looking more at where people think of tokens, where you have a token server that sits in the middle of it, and they get a one-time password, and you enter that in the VPN authentication field. And as Michael Levin told us earlier, all of this is done out of band, so we really don't support. There is no use case where I provide you a one-time password and you go to the application, say that be AnyConnect, maybe your AnyConnect client connecting to a Cisco VPN, and you don't go and enter that one-time password in that client, because that would not be out of band. That's in band with your authentication, which means if there's someone in the middle of that, then they're able to grab that. What we do is out of band, so your one-time password might come in an SMS message, and you would respond in kind back over the SMS, or we can use a PIN with the phone, and instead of the simple press of the hash or pound symbol, depending where you're from, on my phone, Instead of that, I'm required to enter the PIN back into my phone. But again, all of this is done out of band, so we don't take one-time passwords and inject them into the authentication method. Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. And so
It does, but just for a point of clarification, again, we do offer a soft token approach as a backup if your IT department, if your security team wants to enable that. So using the application can act as a soft token. It does generate a one-time PIN, and it is entered in to the browser in a in-band approach. And we offer that because some customers have asked for the scenario, particularly the scenario that executives or somebody's on an airplane, they're offering a Wi-Fi there and there's no phone signal there and they need a way to do that. But again, that is available primarily as a backup and only with the approval of yours and configuration by your security department.
yes, correct. And so that is the traditional sort of token approach, and that's, you know, I'm in a basement, I don't have any signal, and I need to be able to log on in that instance.
I'm on an Ethernet.
Yeah. So the next question is, or yeah, on the airplane, as you said, I think is the example you used, right, Mike?
Right.
So the other question is from Travis is, where do logs go? And I don't think he's talking about logging in rivers or anything like that. So, so it would be or configurable to send to another system. So I guess this is log files associated with people logging on. Can you take that reporting and export it? Might be the nature of that question.
Well, the local MFA server supports syslog, so you could push the logs out using syslog to another server, and there's tons of syslog solutions out in the world. And you can configure where they're stored on the server, so potentially you could create a share and push them over there, but that probably is not a great solution in case for some reason the share stops working, then your logs are unable to be completed. There may be other options I'm unaware of, and Michael can speak up if he knows of any of those.
Okay.
Not speaking up.
Okay, good, thanks. So this is, I think, a certification question. Does your infrastructure have PCI ROC, R-O-C? And I think that is in one of the end slides there where it talks about all the types of certifications. And yes, it does. There it is, yep, PCI DSS. So that's the answer to that question. Thank you, Ken, for that. And the next one is, does your phone application have the ability to do location verification via GPS or eGPS? So where is the person who's using that phone logging on, replying from?
Yeah, and based on the underlying technology that we're using here, a phone call or an SMS, there's no location support in those, so it would be difficult to implement either GPS or AGPS.
But I think there is a feature within Azure that allows you to see where the person is logging on from, whether they're logging on, what's it called, improbable travel scenario. Is
Yes.
that part of this?
That would be more the Windows Azure AD logon. So.
Right. Okay. Very good. Okay. Well, that's it for the questions, and I'd like to thank Mike and Mark for the excellent webinar. And everybody, take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Hopefully, you have the opportunity to join our next webinar. Thanks again, and I hope you appreciate the series.